The alien hunting squad moved with deadly precision through the dense jungle, their footsteps barely disturbing the forest floor. Cloaked in shadows, they were ghosts in the undergrowth, their keen eyes sweeping for any hint of movement. These hunters had a reputation across galaxies, ruthlessly efficient, unyielding, feared. They thrived on pride, each mission a chance to prove they could outmatch any creature, conquer any terrain. This mission, though, had disappointed them. The thought of tracking a lone human soldier seemed beneath them. The commander glanced at his tracking device, watching as a faint heat signature pulsed on the screen. He allowed himself a rare smile beneath his mask. Humans, he mused, were frail, soft creatures, born without claws or fangs. Their entire existence relied on the technology they clung to, a crutch for their lack of true survival skills. Stories circulated among alien ranks, tales of humans who could fight, but the commander brushed these off as myths, legends woven to bolster humanity's fragile ego. His own squad had hunted down beasts capable of tearing through metal, creatures born to kill. In comparison, a human would be child's play. The jungle was thick, each step a battle against vines and underbrush that seemed to reach out, pulling them deeper into its humid, sticky grasp. Despite their technological advantages, the foliage here seemed to resist them, as if the planet itself was pushing back. The commander raised a fist, signaling his squad to halt. He felt something unsettling in the air, a quiet, almost predatory silence. His squad formed a tight circle, their stances wary as they scanned the surrounding shadows. They knew their target was close. Their devices beeped rhythmically, drawing them toward the heat source. He motioned for them to fan out, each member slipping into position with ease. The mission was routine, and he expected nothing out of the ordinary, yet something gnawed at him. He dismissed it, convinced that his experience outweighed any instinctual unease. The soldier lay low in the underbrush, her breathing controlled, her mind processing every detail. She'd been trained for this exact situation, survival in hostile territory, her senses attuned to every shift in the environment. She knew they were close. Their tech might be advanced, but she had experience and instincts honed from years in combat zones. She knew the jungle. She could feel its rhythms and understood how to blend seamlessly into its landscape. Her ears picked up the faint, steady hum of their devices as they scanned the area. She was aware of their positioning, their formation, and she quickly pieced together a plan. The alien hunters might have brute force and advanced equipment, but they lacked subtlety. They relied on technology as a guide, assuming it gave them an unbeatable edge. But she had something they couldn't replicate, an understanding of the hunt that went beyond tools or weapons. They were hunting her, but she'd make them realize just how wrong they were. She didn't run, she moved with care, calculating each step, every movement. She knew the alien hunters expected her to flee, to react with fear, and they would follow without hesitation. They didn't see her as a threat, and that mistake was her greatest advantage. Her training had drilled into her the importance of patience, to let the predator think they were in control, right up until the moment they weren't. The commander's device emitted a faint chirp, signaling an anomaly, a reading that appeared erratic, as if her heat signature had shifted locations in an instant. He frowned, tapping the screen, adjusting the filters, assuming it was interference from the dense canopy above. His squad was silent, waiting for his command, and he felt their impatience, a quiet eagerness to complete this trivial hunt. Another faint beep. This time, closer. The jungle felt like it was closing in around them, its shadows twisting into shapes that seemed to move with a will of their own. He shook his head, reminding himself of his rank, his mission. The human was out there, alone, under-equipped, and outmatched. They had been tracking her heat signature for hours. There was no way she could survive this. But then, a flicker of movement to his left, a quick, subtle flash of something that shouldn't have been there. He snapped his head in that direction, his weapon drawn, only to find nothing. Just the dense, unbroken shadows of the jungle. His breathing quickened, but he dismissed it as an illusion, a trick of the light. His eyes returned to his tracking device, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that they were missing something vital. One of his squad members shifted uncomfortably, their armor creaking in the thick silence. The commander turned, annoyed at the break in discipline, but as he did, he saw a glint, a silent figure in the shadows, a blur of movement. His heart pounded as he raised his weapon, aiming at the spot where he thought he'd seen her. But again nothing. Just the thick, impenetrable darkness of the jungle. He felt a creeping unease gnawing at him now, something he hadn't felt in years. He checked his device, which now displayed a second anomaly, as if the soldier had multiplied, appearing in multiple places at once. He didn't understand it, the readings made no sense. He signaled to his squad, instructing them to tighten their formation. For the first time, he began to wonder if he had misjudged his prey. The soldier, from her hidden position, watched their confusion unfold. She understood the advantage of psychology in combat. Her training had drilled it into her, and she knew when to press the edge. The alien hunters were highly skilled, but they were accustomed to prey that panicked, prey that made mistakes in fear. She offered them neither. Instead, she manipulated their tech, knowing their reliance on it made them vulnerable. Each anomaly on their devices, each false reading, was deliberate, designed to erode their confidence. She was giving them a taste of what it felt like to be hunted. As the commander's frustration grew, he barked orders, sending his squad members to sweep the area in widening arcs. The heat signatures flickered again, and the jungle seemed to shift and breathe, amplifying the disorientation. Every second they spent searching only deepened their anxiety, as if the trees themselves were closing in around them. The commander felt his composure slipping. He was trained to dominate, to lead by strength, but the unfamiliar sensations of dread and uncertainty had started to creep in. His mind raced, struggling to rationalize the malfunctioning equipment, the strange silence, the shadows that seemed to move with intent. It didn't add up. It was as if the jungle itself was alive, an accomplice to his prey. But the truth loomed larger, pressing down with a realization he wasn't ready to face. This human was no ordinary target. The commander's orders were swift, his hand signals clear. The team members fanned out, their weapons raised, eyes darting between trees as they prowled through the dense jungle. The tension within the squad was palpable, but they masked it with rigid discipline, obeying the commander's orders to the letter. They spread in a formation meant to trap, assuming their prey would bolt at any moment. The human soldier, they thought, would be scrambling to hide. That assumption, however, would be their undoing. For several minutes, the squad advanced, every one of them hyper-focused, eager to secure the target. But there was something strange. Each step felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. They weren't accustomed to this. Their hunts were usually clean, quick, direct. They expected prey to run. They expected to chase. Yet here, in this foreign jungle, they were forced to move slowly, their senses strained to the limit. Sweat gathered beneath their armor, and their breathing, though controlled, became slightly labored as the minutes dragged on without sight of their quarry. The tracking device chirped softly, signaling a heat source nearby. One of the squad members took point, creeping forward with practiced stealth, his weapon aimed directly at the source of the reading. But when he got close, he froze, looking around with confusion. It was just a rock, heated slightly by the afternoon sun. The device had malfunctioned, giving them a false lead. He looked back at the commander, who frowned but motioned for them to press on. The soldier watched from a nearby thicket, her gaze sharp and calculating as she tracked their every move. She had studied their tactics, predicting how they'd maneuver. The squad was strong and disciplined, yet she could already see cracks forming. They had spread too wide, slightly off-center, leaving small gaps in their formation. She adjusted her position, allowing herself only the barest movements, using the terrain as her cover. She'd been trained to make her surroundings work for her, to become invisible, blending seamlessly into whatever environment she was in. The aliens, by contrast, were struggling to adapt. They were formidable hunters in open terrain, yet here, amid the claustrophobic depths of the jungle, their rigidity became a disadvantage. The commander kept an eye on the tracker, growing increasingly frustrated. He adjusted the device, recalibrating, convinced it would pick up the human's exact position. But as he did, the device faltered again, picking up random heat signals from all around, flickering erratically. It made no sense. These readings didn't align with the profile of a human. It was as if their prey was everywhere and nowhere at once. The readings couldn't be trusted, and the reality of that fact gnawed at him. A rustling sound to his right had him snapping his head around, his weapon trained on a moving shadow. He fired instinctively, only to realize it was a fallen branch, disturbed by the wind. His error did not go unnoticed by his team. He could sense their surprise, a subtle shift in the air as they registered his lapse in judgment. But he quickly refocused, unwilling to let them see any further sign of weakness. He knew he had to keep control, for their sakes and his own. Another squad member broke formation, stepping over to inspect what appeared to be fresh tracks in the mud. He bent low, scanning the ground for details, trying to make sense of the strange impressions. His eyes traced the outline, confusion flickering across his face as he studied them. They looked like boot prints, yet there was something off about them. He squinted, examining the angle and depth. They were too neat, too precise. Before he could process further, a flash of movement caught his attention from behind, and he spun around, pulse racing. But again, he saw nothing. Just the jungle, silent and unyielding. The soldier watched him from her concealed vantage point, observing the subtle shift in his stance. She knew the exact moment he felt it, the doubt creeping in, the realization that something wasn't adding up. She let him linger in that uncertainty, her presence a constant, unseen weight bearing down on them. She could sense their tension, their discomfort, the way they moved with growing hesitation. The thrill of control pulsed through her veins, her patience unbreakable as she let them stumble further into her web. The commander gritted his teeth, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. He signaled for his squad to regroup, his voice sharp as he barked orders. This hunt was not going as planned, and he knew he had to regain control before the disorientation grew. He ordered tighter formation, deciding to sweep the area slowly and systematically. The squad obeyed, though he could feel the silent question in their minds: why was this simple mission turning into a drawn-out game? They were a well-oiled machine, trained to work in tandem, yet the tension was unmistakable now, a barely perceptible tremor in their once steady hands. The jungle seemed to close in tighter around them, every leaf and shadow conspiring against their mission. They heard sounds they couldn't explain, saw flickers of movement that vanished the moment they looked. The soldier, however, was fully in control. She had calculated their every move, planting subtle distractions, setting traps without leaving a single trace of her own. It was as if the jungle itself had become her weapon, and she wielded it with ruthless precision. A distant cry pierced the silence, sharp and filled with raw, unfiltered panic. One of the squad members had veered too far off course, his instincts betraying him as he tried to break free of the oppressive surroundings. The rest of the team froze, every sense on high alert as they strained to locate him. But the jungle swallowed the sound, leaving only an echo of his voice. No one moved. For the first time, fear crept into their expressions. It was a feeling foreign to them, something they hadn't experienced on any hunt before. They weren't used to being on the other side of the chase. The commander clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain calm, though the doubt had started to creep in, subtle yet undeniable. He signaled his squad to close ranks, his voice firm as he reassured them, despite his own misgivings. He reminded them that their target was just a human, a single, vulnerable creature, alone and desperate. But his words felt hollow, even to himself, and he could see the same uncertainty mirrored in their eyes. Another flash of movement, this time closer, so brief they barely registered it. A shadow passing between trees, a ghost slipping through their line of sight. One of the squad members raised his weapon, ready to fire, but hesitated, his finger hovering above the trigger, as he realized he was aiming at empty air. He lowered his weapon, a glint of confusion and fear crossing his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a sudden, crushing silence fell over them. The soldier could feel the momentum shift. She knew they were on the edge, teetering between confidence and fear, their arrogance slowly crumbling under the weight of her relentless patience. Every step they took brought them further into her territory, her carefully orchestrated trap. She was no longer simply evading them. She was pulling them deeper, forcing them to question every movement, every sound, every shadow. The commander scanned the shadows, his mind racing with possibilities. He'd underestimated her. This human was no ordinary target. She was something else entirely, a predator that had lured them in, dissecting their every tactic with precision. He could feel her watching them, an unseen force surrounding them, an apex predator hidden in plain sight. They could feel it too now, the realization dawning on each member of the squad. They weren't hunting her. She was hunting them. The first shot rang out, a precise, calculated burst from somewhere in the foliage. The squad member closest to the blast dropped, silent and still before he even hit the ground. The others froze, instinctively ducking for cover, their eyes darting around, searching for the source of the attack. The commander clenched his jaw, feeling the first pang of real panic as he barked an order to regroup. But his command faltered, caught in the oppressive quiet that settled over them like a heavy blanket. Their prey wasn't just hiding, she was eliminating them, one by one. The squad formed a tighter circle, backs to each other, weapons raised and scanning. Every direction felt dangerous, every shadow a potential threat. The commander tried to maintain composure, but the cracks were beginning to show. He was trained to handle high-stakes situations, to adapt quickly, but this was unlike anything he'd faced before. His mind raced through options, contingency plans, yet each scenario ended the same way. His team was outmatched, struggling against an invisible foe who knew the terrain far better than they did. A low, nearly inaudible rustle drew his attention to his left. He turned, weapon raised, as another squad member caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of his eye. He fired instinctively, a sharp crack that shattered the silence, but hit nothing. His breathing quickened, chest heaving as he backed into formation, glancing nervously at the commander. The fear was unmistakable now, a ripple spreading through the ranks. Their foe was everywhere and nowhere at once, using the jungle itself as an ally, twisting the environment into a weapon. The commander's focus sharpened. He knew he had to regain control, to keep his squad from unraveling completely. But before he could issue another command, a second shot came from the shadows. Another soldier fell, slumping wordlessly into the underbrush. The sound was soft, a final whisper, as the jungle swallowed him. The squad tensed, glancing around wildly, their confidence crumbling under the weight of their own helplessness. They had never been hunted before, not like this. They'd faced dangerous prey, yes, but always with the assurance that their superior numbers and technology would guarantee victory. Now both felt useless, stripped away by an enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move. The soldier watched from her concealed position, her gaze cold and unyielding. She could sense their panic, smell the fear wafting from them as they scrambled to understand what was happening. She had them cornered, locked in a mental trap as much as a physical one. They might have had technology, but she had mastery over this landscape, and she wielded it with ruthless efficiency. Their terror was palpable, fueling her resolve as she moved silently, calculating her next strike. She wasn't simply killing them, she was dismantling their confidence, unraveling their pride one shot at a time. Another squad member muttered something under his breath, his voice laced with fear, his eyes darting around as he clutched his weapon. The commander glared at him, silencing the outburst with a look, but he couldn't deny the truth. His own hands were beginning to shake. The confidence that had carried him through countless hunts was gone, replaced by a gnawing dread that tightened around his chest. He'd been so sure of this mission, so certain that no human could pose a real threat. But this woman was more than he'd imagined, more skilled, more relentless, a predator who had studied them, anticipated their weaknesses, and used their own tactics against them. He swallowed, forcing himself to stay focused. He had to keep his remaining men alive, had to regroup, but as he glanced around, he realized that even the slightest motion felt dangerous. The jungle, which had once seemed like just another hostile landscape, had transformed into something far more sinister, a labyrinth designed to trap and consume them. Every step felt weighted with the knowledge that they were being watched, hunted, outsmarted by a foe they couldn't even see. Another squad member took a cautious step forward, his eyes fixed on a suspicious cluster of shadows. But before he could move any closer, a figure darted out, quick and silent. The soldier lunged, an almost ghostly blur of motion, and before he could react, she'd struck, disappearing back into the shadows as swiftly as she'd appeared. The man staggered, his weapon clattering to the ground as he fell, the life draining from him as his squadmates looked on, frozen in horror. The remaining members stood in stunned silence, their breathing harsh, uneven. The commander fought the urge to curse, his frustration and fear twisting into a raw, bitter realization: they weren't going to leave this jungle alive. He felt the truth settle over him, a heavy weight pressing down, suffocating him. His gaze hardened, his pride scraping against the edges of his mind as he tried to formulate a new plan, but he knew it was too late. The tables had turned, completely and irrevocably. The soldier remained unseen, her focus absolute as she prepared for the final phase of her attack. She'd broken their ranks, shattered their morale, and now she'd finish what she started. Moving silently, she circled them, her footsteps inaudible against the jungle floor. Her patience was unyielding, her movements calculated, every breath measured. She could see them, each one of them, their expressions raw with fear and resignation, stripped of the arrogance they'd once worn so confidently. The commander gripped his weapon, scanning the shadows with a look that bordered on desperation. His mind raced, scrambling for options, but his training offered no guidance here. Every tactic he'd ever learned, every strategy he'd ever trusted, had failed him. She had taken their methods, twisted them, and turned them against him, leaving him with nothing but a hollow, suffocating sense of defeat. He realized, in that moment, that he was no longer the hunter. He was the prey, helpless in the face of a superior predator. The soldier chose her moment carefully, waiting until the commander's guards slipped just enough. Then, in one swift, silent movement, she closed the distance, emerging from the shadows to confront him. He spun, weapon raised, but she was faster. With a calculated strike, she disarmed him, his weapon clattering uselessly to the ground. For the first time, he saw her face, her expression cold, determined, and utterly fearless. She held his gaze, allowing him a brief, searing moment of understanding. He tried to speak, but no words came, his breath catching in his throat as he recognized the truth. She was the apex predator, and he had been nothing but a trespasser in her territory. She didn't hesitate, didn't offer him a second chance. With one final, decisive movement, she finished the job, her actions swift, efficient, and devoid of mercy. The jungle fell silent once more, the echoes of the hunt fading into the dense foliage. She stood there, alone, the last living presence in the clearing, her gaze steady as she surveyed the aftermath. There was no triumph in her expression, only a quiet, unwavering certainty. She had done what was necessary, survived because she had to, proven herself as the true hunter in a game where the stakes had been her life. As the last traces of the alien squad vanished into the shadows, she turned, blending seamlessly back into the jungle. She moved with purpose, each step confident and sure, leaving no trace behind. The forest had become her ally, her shield, her weapon. The hunt was over, but her vigilance remained. She knew that, somewhere out there, others like them would come, driven by arrogance and hubris, convinced of their superiority. And she would be waiting, ready to show them the truth. The commander stumbled through the dense jungle, wounded, disoriented, his mind spiraling between fury and fear. Every sound was amplified, each shadow a potential threat. He had no illusions left. The mission had failed, his squad was gone, and the realization gnawed at him that he was now alone in hostile territory, the hunted instead of the hunter. His breaths came in ragged gasps as he pushed through the thick undergrowth, hoping to find an escape route, something, anything that could offer a way out. He knew it was futile, but he couldn't help clinging to the remnants of his survival instinct. Behind him, the jungle remained still, an unsettling quiet that seemed to echo his desperation. He strained to listen, knowing she was out there, somewhere, watching his every move. His mind raced, replaying each moment of the hunt, every tactical decision he'd made, searching for some mistake, some overlooked detail that could explain how they'd lost control so completely. But it was useless. Every step he took felt like it was leading him further into her trap, a maze he could never hope to navigate. His mind, once sharp and decisive, was clouded with dread. He felt the weight of her presence, an invisible force pressing down on him. She was close, he could feel it, her gaze heavy on his back as he staggered forward. Every instinct told him to keep moving, but with each step, he could feel the energy draining from his body. The wound on his side throbbed painfully, a constant reminder of how easily she dismantled his squad, picking them off one by one. His confidence, once unshakable, had been stripped away, leaving only a raw, vulnerable desperation. He paused, scanning the area, his weapon clutched tightly in his trembling hands. His eyes darted from shadow to shadow, trying to anticipate her next move, but the jungle seemed to close in around him, swallowing every trace of sound, every flicker of movement. It was as if the forest itself had turned against him, a hostile entity conspiring with her to seal his fate. He swallowed, feeling a bead of sweat roll down his temple, his mind fraying under the relentless pressure of the unseen threat. His training, his experience, none of it mattered anymore. Then, as he strained to listen, he heard it, a faint rustle in the brush behind him. He spun, weapon raised, eyes wide and frantic, but there was nothing there. Just the dense foliage, thick and impenetrable. He took a shaky breath, realizing that she was toying with him, drawing out his fear, feeding off the tension that now consumed him. He was trapped, a puppet in her game, each movement he made serving only to deepen her control. Suddenly, a soft voice broke the silence, low and cold, carrying a calm certainty that made his blood run cold. She spoke, her tone devoid of emotion, her words precise and cutting, driving into him like a blade. She mocked his arrogance, his overconfidence, the blind hubris that had led him and his squad into her hands. Each word was like a mirror, forcing him to confront his own mistakes, his failure to recognize her as anything other than prey. He tried to respond, to muster some shred of defiance, but the words caught in his throat. He had nothing left. His pride, his authority, everything he'd relied on was gone, dismantled piece by piece in the course of a single hunt. He was no longer a commander, no longer a leader. He was simply prey, stripped of his identity, reduced to a helpless, terrified being. A rustle to his right, and he turned, his body reacting instinctively, but he knew it was futile. She moved like a shadow, slipping in and out of sight, always one step ahead. His breaths came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding as he realized that there was no escape. The jungle, once just an alien landscape, now felt like a prison, every tree, every shadow a reminder of his impending end. Then, finally, she appeared, stepping out from the shadows with a quiet, lethal grace. She was calm, her expression unreadable, her gaze steady as she regarded him. There was no anger, no satisfaction, just a cold, unflinching resolve. She held his gaze, allowing him a moment to see her for what she truly was, a hunter, a survivor, an apex predator who had claimed her territory with unwavering precision. The commander felt a hollow ache in his chest, a quiet resignation settling over him as he looked into her eyes. He understood now, understood that she was beyond him, beyond anything he'd ever faced. She had outmatched him in every way, using the very skills he'd underestimated, turning his arrogance into her greatest weapon. In that moment, he knew that his legacy, his reputation, meant nothing. He was simply another failure, another mistake to be erased. He lowered his weapon, a final act of surrender, his shoulders slumping as he accepted his fate. She didn't move, didn't react, simply watching him with that same, unblinking intensity. It was as if she was giving him one last chance to understand, to see himself as he truly was, stripped of his pride, his illusions, everything that had defined him. In one swift, precise movement, she stepped forward, her presence filling the space between them. He felt a surge of terror, a final, desperate instinct to run, to escape, but he was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by her gaze. She was relentless, unyielding, a force of nature that he could neither fight nor flee. And then, with a single, decisive motion, she ended it. The jungle returned to silence, the echoes of their confrontation fading into the thick canopy above. She stood there for a moment, her expression calm, her focus unwavering. She'd done what needed to be done, eliminated the threat with a precision that left no room for error. There was no satisfaction, no sense of victory, only the quiet certainty of a job completed, a task fulfilled. She turned, slipping back into the shadows, her movements fluid, almost serene. The forest seemed to welcome her, closing around her as she disappeared from sight, leaving no trace of the hunt, no sign of the struggle that had just taken place. She became part of the jungle once more, an unseen presence that moved with purpose, each step a reminder of her mastery over the land. As she vanished into the depths of the forest, the echoes of her presence lingered, a quiet testament to her strength, her resilience. She was the apex predator, the unchallenged force within her domain, and she knew that this jungle, this untamed, wild landscape, was her territory. The hunt was over, but her vigilance remained. She would be ready, waiting, for whatever challenge came next, her senses attuned to every shift, every sound. And as the jungle returned to its quiet, watchful state, she moved on, leaving nothing behind but a story, a legend whispered in the shadows, a reminder that in the depths of the wilderness, there were forces far stronger, far more dangerous, than any alien hunter could ever comprehend.